This is a lovely, calming and very relaxing, easy painting to create yourself at home, and it makes for a lovely collection if you want to do a whole series of them. As always, I'm going to be talking you through step by step and showing you exactly what I'm doing here on my canvas and how I'm mixing up the colours, which shades I'm using, which brands of paint I'm using. But as always, please feel free to change up the colours and the shades or the composition that you want for your own painting. I'm going to be using acrylic paints today, and I'm going to start with a lot of white paint. I'm going to be mixing a lot of my colours together, and I want to create slightly more pastel shades, which is why I need quite a lot of white. Next up, I have a Winsor & Newton Pale Olive. This is just a really light green colour. If you haven't got this colour, you can just mix up your own version using some blue and some yellow paint, or if you've already got some green paint, you can just add lots of white to it to make it more pastel. Next, I have a cadmium yellow. You can apply these to your palette in any order that you like. Some artists have a strategic place that they like to pop their paints on their palette. I just tend to place them anywhere. I've now got a cadmium red. Next up, I have a Hooker's Green. This is the System 3 original brand. This is just a dark, very dark kind of mossy green colour. And then I have a black paint. This is Mars Black and System 3 acrylic. I'll just pop that, a little bit of that in the corner. I'm going to be using the black just to make my paint tone slightly more earthy in colour. I'm going to be painting on a stretched canvas today. This is just a canvas that's literally stretched over wood. If you haven't got a canvas like this, you don't need to paint on one. You can paint on some thick cards, some paper, anything you like. And you can really do this on any size canvas that you like as well. I then have an array of different paintbrushes here. I like to have a few just on standby. I won't be using all of these, but it's just nice to have a few. You can use any size of paintbrush that you like. I have my kitchen towel. This is just to dab my brushes off with, just to get rid of any excess paint, any excess water. And my cup of water. I'm going to be using this to wash my brushes, but also to add some water into the paint mixture just to keep the paint nice and fluid. Because we're using acrylic paint, it can dry quite quickly, so the water really helps give it a refresh. I'm going to be adding quite a few different shapes to my background. Again, you can add any shapes and patterns that you want, but I just want to start by giving the whole of the background of my canvas a wash of just one block colour, just so it's not completely stark white. So I'm just going to take my bigger brush, dipping it in the water. I'm just going to mix up that first colour now. So if you're also doing this, you're going to want to make sure you're mixing up enough of this paint just to fill that whole background. And I'm going to go for a very light beige shade. So I'm just going to start by moving over a couple of scoops of my white paint, maybe 2 or 3, just depending on the size of your canvas that you're using. And then to this, I'm going to add a little bit of my yellow and a little bit of my red. Now I'm only adding a very small amount, and I'm just going to mix this up. This should hopefully give us a very, very pale, sort of peachy beige colour. If you feel like you've added a little bit too much red, like I've done here, don't worry, you can just add some more yellow, unless you really like the colour that you're making. I always say painting is personal preference. You might aim to make one colour, you might come up with something different, but you might actually prefer it. And remember, if you've mixed up a shade that you're really not happy with, you're not obliged to use it. You can just start again. Paint mixing is a really fun part of the painting journey. It's nice to experiment, try new things, be easy on yourself. The lovely thing about what we're painting today is it doesn't need to be precise, it's quite stylistic. What I'm going to do now, once I'm happy with that colour, I'm just going to add a few drops of water into this mixture. As I mentioned, this is just going to help keep the paint nice and fluid when we come to apply it to the canvas. It just helps it blend into the canvas a little bit easier. So whenever you're ready, this is the fun bit. We're just going to paint the whole of our background. Now this is where you can decide what sort of artistic flair you want to go for. You might want to be really neat with your brush strokes and have a very flat finish with your paint, or you might want to go a little bit more choppy, in which case you might want to apply the paint in a thicker more abstract way. Sometimes it just depends on the mood that you're in, or the outcome that you're wanting to achieve with your own painting. You can always try both, see which one aligns with you most today. And if you are painting a stretched canvas, you might want to paint the sides, the top and the bottom as well, or you might prefer to leave them blank. Some artists choose to paint the sides and the top so that no matter what angle you're looking at it, the whole of the canvas is covered, and others decide not to. If you're going to be framing this eventually, then you don't need to paint the sides and the top and the bottom. You can just leave them blank. If you want to speed up the paint drying process as well, you can always use a hairdryer just on a low heat and just give it a gentle dry in between each layer that you're creating. This will just speed up the process, or if you're quite happy just to mix up another colour and wait for the paint to dry naturally, it's totally up to you. Now that I've covered the back, I'm just going to give my brush a really good wash in the water. I like to give it a gentle tap on the base of the cup. This just helps lift off any of the excess paint. While I wait for my background to dry, I'm going to move back over to my paint palette and mix up my next colour. So this is where you can just have fun with the paint shades that you're mixing up. I'm just going to pick up another brush. You can use the same brush because you've washed it, or you can use a new brush. If you're using a new brush, just dip it in the water just to loosen up the bristles. And then moving back over to my paint palette, I'm just going to mix up my next shade. So I'm going to be going for a dark kind of earthy green colour, but I'm actually going to use some of this light peachy beige colour that I've got as my undertone. So I'm going to pick some of it up, just a scoop, move it to a spare area on your palette. If you haven't got any space, you can always use a plate from the kitchen. And then to this beige colour, I'm just going to start scooping up some of this darker green that I've got, and I'm going to mix it in. Now mixing it in with a paint that's got some white paint in it will basically make your paint a little bit more opaque, so less see-through. So it gives it a slightly kind of thicker look, which is what I want to achieve because we're doing layers here. I want to make sure that the paint isn't too see-through so we don't see beneath it. Now, because I want to darken this up slightly, I'm now just going to start gradually introducing a tiny little bit of black. So you can either be very careful and just pick up a small bit of black at the end of your paintbrush, like I've done here, or if you want a little bit more control, just pick up one of your smaller brushes and you can add the black nice and gradually. We just want to be able to control the colour that we're making. So I'm just going to continue to add a small amount of the black till I've darkened up this shade. If you haven't got green available in your art kit and you really would like to make a green, you can make your own shade using yellow and blue. So as you can see, I'm just very gradually adding more of the black just so I can control the colour. I might also just add a tiny little bit of yellow into this and a tiny little bit of red. Again, this is where you can experiment with your colours. You don't have to follow along with me. Adding the yellow and the red just gives it a slightly warmer undertone. Whenever you're happy with your colour, we're now just going to add a little bit of water into this mix, just like we've been doing before. Really stir it in. And then this is the fun bit, because we're now just going to start adding some shapes to the background of our canvas. And this is really, you can do anything you want, and keeping mine nice and flowing. I want to have quite freeing shapes, nothing too angular. Just doing a curved line and letting it flow off the side and the top of the canvas as well. I'm just going to thicken up this line. If your paint underneath is still wet, you'll find that it will blend in with it slightly. If you're happy with that and you like the effect, you like the look, then great. If not, then don't worry, just wait for the background to dry a little bit more, and then you can just go ahead and add some more of this colour over the top. Because we're trying to be quite free with this painting, don't overthink the lines that you're making. Just let your mind wander off. And let your paintbrush do its thing. There is no right or wrong with this. Once you're happy, we can give our brush a good wash in the water. Feel free to change and refresh your water whenever you feel like you need to. I'm going to move back over to my paint palette now and mix up my next shade. So I'm going to stick with the green tones, but I'm just going to do a slightly different colour, probably slightly lighter, and I'm going to be using this olive green that I've got here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to introduce a little bit of this green into maybe half of this colour that I've just used, and just see what I turn up with. Again, this is just experimenting, trying different things out. And the reason why I'm only mixing it into half is just in case I want to use some of the darker green later on. I still have some of it left. It's also quite nice to see the different tones that you're making right next to each other. Add a little bit of water. And I'm going to go back over to painting and add the next shape. Again, I'm not thinking about this too much, because I'm going for a sort of plant theme. I'm just keeping that in mind. So I'm using curved shapes as though they could be large leaves in the background. But they're very impressionist. They're almost a suggestion of the leaf rather than it actually looking like one. And we're going to be painting over the top of these as well with other shapes. So this almost just becomes one of the layers in our background. And if you are painting the sides, just remember to paint them as you go along, as you're using the colour that you're using on the front. Just wrap it around the sides and the top and the bottom. Once you're happy, we can just give our brush another wash again. I'm going to move on to creating some slightly warmer tones now, using some of the yellow and the red to create a slightly more burnt orange effect with my paint. So I'm actually going to use some of the beige that I've got left as my base. Don't worry if you haven't got any beige left, you can just use some white because we're going to be adding the yellow and the red on the top. I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, and really mix it in, and this should give us quite a bright orange tone. If you want it slightly more on the pink peach side, add some more red. If you want it slightly more on the orange side, add a little bit more of the yellow. Now, I actually love this colour, but it is quite bright against the tones that I'm using. So I'm just going to start darkening it up ever so slightly. And the way I'm going to darken it is just by introducing a tiny little bit of black again, but we want to introduce it really, really slowly. This is just going to help give it a slightly more grey undertone where it mixes in with that white that we've already got underneath. So just the tiniest bit goes a really long way. It almost makes it look like a dusty peach shade. Again, just make sure you're mixing up enough paint. You don't want to have too little and you run out and have to make more. It's just nice to make sure you're mixing up plenty. I'm just going to take this colour and I'm going to do a circle on this top section here of the painting. And I'm just going to start really small and then make it bigger and bigger. I don't want it to merge in with the green, and the green underneath is still a little bit wet. So I'm going to do this nice and slowly. How I like to do this is just load up my paintbrush with the paint that I'm going to use. Push the bristles of the brush down flat onto the canvas and then twist the handle of the brush all the way around 360. You might want to use 2 hands for this. Just keep those bristles pushed down, slowly twisting the brush all the way around, and it should give you a pretty nice circle shape that you can use as your base. And you might just be happy with that. If you want to carry on and just start making it a little bit bigger, taking off some of the excess paint, you can just gradually push the bristles down, let them fan out, and then twist the brush around and it will just push that paint outwards. Remember, we don't need a perfect circle. I just think this is quite a nice tip to know in case you want to use it. You might also like to do a couple of different layers of this paint, and if you do want to do that, you're going to have to wait for them to dry and then go back over them. It's just always an option. Moving back over to my paint palette, I'm just going to darken up this colour now. So I'm going to add a little bit more of this beige colour as my base. If you haven't got that colour, just add a little bit of white as the base. This is just to make some more paint. I'm going to add some yellow to it, a little bit more than I did last time. Same with the red, and just give that a mix and see what colour you come up with. It might be similar to what you've already got. If it is, you just want to add a little bit more of the yellow, a little bit more of the red. You might prefer to add slightly more yellow this time, or you might prefer to add slightly more red. Completely up to you. So this has given us a much brighter colour again. So if you do want to earth it up slightly, make it a little bit duller, a little bit more of a grey undertone, we're just going to start adding a little bit of the black. If you quite like this terracotta bright shade, you can stick with it. I'm just going to add a very small amount of black just to darken it up. Also going to add a little bit more of the red and the yellow. A little bit more of the black just to make it even darker. And once you're happy, just add some water back into it and really mix it up. And whenever you're happy, we can move back over to our canvas, and this is completely up to you what kind of shape that you want to do. At this point, you might want to do a sort of loose plant pot-like shape, or you might just want to keep it really, really fluid. What I might do is show you how to do the plant pot shape so you have the idea for it. So I'm just going to move over to a slightly more pointy brush. And taking this colour. I'm just going to draw out the shape. What's quite nice about this is you can always give it a go, and if you hate it, you can always do a really big blob over the top. So I'm just going to do a very loose plant pot shape. I'm going to do quite like a thin, almost like one of those bottles, those glass bottles that you sometimes find on shelves. So it's got a little spout at the top and then it comes around quite wide. Again, the nice thing about this is we don't want it to be neat or straight or precise. Now I'm just going to fill it in with that same colour. Always take a step back, look at something else for a moment and then come back to your painting. Decide if you want to change up the shape slightly. Whenever you're ready, you can just wash your brush. I'm going to mix up one more colour for my background, and I just want it to be a slightly more yellowy tone. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of my yellow paint to the palette. And taking one of my brushes, I'm just going to mix up this shade now. So actually I'm just going to move it over to near where I've got the white, because I'm going to add a little bit of white to it just to lighten it up. Now because I'm sticking with this earthy like tone, I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of the black to it, tiny dab. You can always add it to your paintbrush, dab it off and then add it in. A little bit will go a really long way here. Always add a little bit more if you feel like you need to. And I'm just going to add another shape into my painting, and because this has now started to dry, I might just do another sort of circle, maybe slightly more wobbly circle. Because I'm going over the green, I might end up having to do a few different coats of this. Like I mentioned before, it's nice just to do the first coat, let the paint dry and then go over it. If you add the paint on top of wet paint, it just pulls off the paint that you've just added. So you can either give it a little dry with the hairdryer, or you can just be patient and wait for it to dry. If you are using acrylic paint, it doesn't take too long. As soon as it's dried, you can just go ahead and add another layer. When you're ready, you can give your brush another wash. And if you're happy with how many shapes and colours that you've got on the background of your canvas, we're now going to move on to creating the colour for our leaves. So this is up to you. I like to go for a really dark colour just to make sure the leaves really stand out against the background, but you can use any colour that you wish for this. You also have a couple of options with the placement of the leaves. You might want to do slightly bigger ones in the foreground, sort of maybe coming out from the base of the canvas and just overlapping everything so you just see these in the distance. Or if you have done a vase, you might want to utilise the vase shape and just do slightly smaller leaves coming out and then the leaves coming off of the branches, if that makes sense. So you have a few different options here, or you might want to do both. A few leaves coming out there and then maybe a bigger one out beside, totally up to you. We're going to start though by mixing up our colour first. So I'm going to be picking up one of my brushes and I'm going to be using this black, so the black that I've got left here. I'm then just going to add a little bit of white to it, just to give it a slightly more grey tone. Again, the white just helps make the paint slightly more opaque. And if you feel like you've run out, you might just want to mix up a little bit more. So I might add a little bit more black onto my palette, just so I have more paint to work with. Add a little bit more of the white to it, just really mix it in. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of my dark green into this as well. So it's going to be a very, very dark shade, but it will just have a slightly more grey-green undertone. Now the trick with this is we want to make sure that our paint is very watered down. We almost want it more of an inky consistency rather than a thick paint consistency. And the reason we want more inky is it just makes it easier to draw nice crisp lines with. So as we come to painting in our branches and our leaves, it just makes it easier to get nice crisp shapes. If you quite like the dry brush look, then don't add the water in. So as soon as you feel like you've got enough of your paint mixture, we can then just go ahead and we're going to add quite a few drops of water to this just to get that nice inky consistency. So I'm just going to bring my palette over to my water cup. You always need more than you think, so I'm just dipping the brush in the water, bringing over that water into the paint, and then give it a really good mix. We want the paint to still have the consistency of the pigment of the paint in there. We don't want it to be too thin. When we come to bring it on, we still want lots of paint in there, but we just want it more juicy. That's what I would say. Juicy is probably the right word. So this is quite a good consistency. It flows nicely on the brush and it's easy to mix. You'll probably find that you'll need to add water as you go just to help loosen up the paint. So I'm going to move over to one of my smaller brushes now. So I'm just going to pop this one into the water cup. And I'm just going to move over to one of my smaller pointy brushes, dipping it in the water to start with. So I want to show you, if you do want to add branches to your vase, if you've done the vase, I'm just going to show you this now. So there are two options. You can either bring the branch down so you actually see it in between, like if this is a glass vase, for example, you would kind of see it coming down inside here. So you can almost bring the branch down from here and have it poking out the top. Or if this is like a solid terracotta pot in your eyes, you would just have the branches just sticking out the top. So totally up to you. I'll just start by showing you doing it from poking out the top. At this point, I would also make sure that your painting is quite dry before you go ahead and do this, just so you can rest your hand on the canvas. So I'm just starting at the top of the pot. I'm just going to do a long, thin line, curving around, and I'm ignoring all of the patterns underneath. This is where you'll soon realise if your paint is still a little bit thick and needs more water, because it'll be very separated when you come to painting it onto the canvas. So that's our first sort of branch. What we can then do is the leaf shapes that come out from the top and the sides. Now, again, these are quite fun, very free shapes. We just want to start with the tip, we bring them out slightly and then curve it in. And then do the same on the other side. Now these can be lovely and wobbly. We don't want them to be too neat and straight. And here is where you have another choice. You can either leave them open or you can fill them in. I would always suggest leaving them all open first. You can then see from a style point of view if you prefer it. And if not, you can then go ahead and fill the leaves in with the same block colour. And don't worry about these too much. We don't want them to be symmetrical. They need to be nice and free, individual. As long as they kind of meet that first main branch, that's all that really matters. And I just like bringing mine out to a little bit more of a point at the ends. You can also vary the shape and the size as you go. And I'm just pushing down lightly with my brush. I'm almost just using the very tip of the bristles while I do this. If you have a couple of different paintbrush sizes available to you, you might just want to try a few different out. You might prefer one to another. Maybe the leaves are slightly smaller as you get down to where the neck of the vase is. This is where you can decide if you want to fill in your leaves or not. I'm going to fill in mine just so that you can see what that option looks like. But remember, you can always add another leaf maybe coming out the side that's slightly bigger, and if you like the look of the empty leaves, you could always do that with another branch that you paint. But I'm just taking the same colour. I'm just using the same brush, but I'm just going to colour in these leaves. This is also a nice opportunity if you want to change the shape slightly or make them more pointy at the end. You can always go ahead and do that as you fill them in. If you're leaning your hand on your art, just be mindful not to smudge anything that you've already painted. And remember, take your time, there's absolutely no rush. I would now suggest having a little stand back. You can decide if there's anything else you want to add. I think I'm going to add a sort of branch or a leaf just coming down this side of the canvas here. I'm just using the same brush and the same paint colour. Again, with these leaves, you might want to start with having them empty, and then you can decide if you want to fill them up. Sometimes it's nice to have a variety. Then you can also just do the underside as well. I'm going to have this sort of flowing off the sides of the canvas. So I quite like the look that these leaves are more open, so I'm actually just going to stick with them a bit more open and have those ones closed. The next thing you can do, if you want to, is you can just add a few extra little details. So what I like to do is just take this same colour and you can just do a few dots or some circles. If you feel like there's anywhere on your canvas that just needs something, this is quite a nice little extra to do. You can always do one and then another one slightly smaller nearby. I might also just add a line, swizzly line going up around here. Just to add a little bit more detail. This is essentially us just doodling on our painting. Equally, if you're happy with how yours is looking, I would advise taking a little step back. And if you're happy, then you can put your paintbrush down and step away from your canvas. This is where we can easily overdo it, especially if you want a slightly more simplistic look. So there we have our boho-inspired art. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you found it relaxing and calming, and you now have some new art for your homes. If you've enjoyed this video, then do be sure to give us a little thumbs up and mention it in the comments below. It really does help us out. We are Brush and Bubbles. We are on Instagram and TikTok now. So if you'd like to follow us on those platforms and see what else we get up to, we would love to have you there. Thank you. Bye.